Today we're going to be focusing on putting dimensions on a drawing. This is a specific drawing that I've used a few times to do dimensioning practices because it's got a variety of different dimensions that need to get placed. But before we can actually start on dimensions, we need to put center lines and center marks where the circles and arcs happen to be placed. So first off, I want to make sure that I have the proper layers as indicated. So I've got center lines, center marks, and then I've got a variety of the object lines, and my hidden lines that you can see currently are there. And so I also have popped up here the properties window. So if I were to select the hidden line that signifies a hole, you can see that that hidden line is indicated by a specific line type, and it has a line type scale of 1. So the line type is by layer, which means that I need to go back to the layer command to set the line type up. So I need to make sure that my center lines are also set up. So right now my center line layers all are continuous line types. Well, that's not going to work. So what we're going to need to do is set the center lines up as center or center 2. So line types have to get loaded into the layers, which we've talked about in previous videos. And that's a matter of using the load button and loading the proper line type into the layer listing. So if I choose center for my center line, and then I've got center and center for my center mark, we now have all the line types of center loaded for the different types of locations. Now we don't know if this is going to work or not. What's the difference between center and center 2? Well, center 2 has twice as many breaks, or it's half the scale of the regular line type. And so we might find out that we might need to change this to actually work. So putting in center lines or center line types, or center marks are actually a dimensional tool. Center lines are a drawing tool. So let's go ahead and put up a center line, and we're going to draw a line type. Now the question is, where should that line type be drawn? Well, the center line needs to be halfway between these two. How do I know where halfway between the two are? Well, there's a couple of ways to do this. Number one is I can draw a construction line across and then find the midpoint, which is a really good way to do that. Or if I know what the size of the hole is, I could find that halfway point and draw a construction line over halfway. Since I don't know what the size of this hole is, I'm just going to draw a temporary line, and then I'm going to start a new center line at the midpoint of that line. The triangle indicates the midpoint. If you don't get the midpoint to pop up down here on the bottom, we have all of the different tools that are available to snap to. And that's the key, is that we want to control the different snap settings that we want to work with. And we want to make sure that the midpoint is highlighted or turned on as a snap setting. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line from this midpoint, but I'm not going to start right here at the top of the line. I'm actually going to bring it straight up perpendicular and then draw it a little bit longer than the object. And what that will do is that will guarantee that I'll have a center line that will extend past the object surface, which is the goal. Now I still have that construction line there, so I can now pick that construction line and delete it. And so now I've got a center line that's indicated in the center of that hidden hole or slot. Center marks, as I mentioned, are a dimensional tool, and I always like to put the center marks on a separate layer. I know it's an extra layer that you have to create. However, if you want to turn things on and off or control the visibility or control the line types, it's easiest to put them on a separate layer. I do not recommend drawing a line, selecting it, and then changing the individual line type. Keeping the line type by layer makes it easier for you to manage the overall drawing. So this happens to be a dimensional tool. And so we could find under Annotate the center mark tool. Okay, so this is under the Annotate ribbon. We could find the center mark tool, which is right here. And if we pick a circle and we're on the center mark layer, we get a center mark. And if we pick the biggest radius, it will center mark and it will center mark. But what do we do in between the two? Can we draw a center line? Yes, we could. Or here's another option. We could also extend these lines. So I'll extend this about halfway. So that way the arrows connect. And that doesn't work too well because notice that it's a solid line. It's not a center line because there's not enough gaps in there. So then what do? Well, I can undo this. And if I draw a regular line in there, so I'll go back to the home screen, pick line. If I draw a line in here, notice that the distance of the line is not long enough. So I need to go back to my center layer, or excuse me, my centerline layer property. And there's actually some settings that we can work with on this. So on our, right now, center marks are the current one. Let's go ahead and check and make sure center lines is our current layer. And so center lines is our current layer. We're using the center line. Now we could also go to center 2, which is half the size, which is good. Now that added additional breaks here, but didn't change anything here because this is still on the layer called center marks. Well, I can change that by putting it onto the center line layer. So still nothing. What if we were to extend this line a little bit farther? Would it help? Now all I did was connect it to the endpoints of the existing line. And you notice that when I do that, I lengthen it long enough that we actually get a break in here. So it's directly over the other line. It's not going to be seen. There is a situation where we could trim this back, but if we trim it, then we won't get a break in that. So again, we want to make sure that this is part of the center lines layer. And we can change it either here or in the properties window. And that center lines layer actually has a line type called center 2 as that setting. And that's the key. We had to go to half scale for that to show up properly. So now that we have the center lines created, what we can do is we can begin putting the dimensions. And again, dimensions are based on the center line locations. So I'm going to make sure that I'm in the right layer for dimensioning. And I'll choose the dimension command. And again, this is under the home screen. If we went under Annotate, we'd have more options. But under the home screen, for the basic dimensions, we have linear and we have a general dimension. If we choose general dimension, we pick the endpoints of the extension lines on the center marks, we have a dimension. And we know that all the dimensions, that's a problem. Notice how angle that is? You want to straighten that up to make sure it's vertical. And I'm actually selecting the endpoint of the other arrowhead. So they purposefully align. But notice that as we have dimensioned, we've got 4 decimal places. Well, that's a lot of decimal places for a basic dimension. I can edit individual dimensions and change the number of decimal places. Whether it's in the properties window, or I can also do it as a right mouse click and edit the precision of that dimension. So the deal is, inside the properties window, I can actually go in and edit this. But that's a lot. There's a lot of options here. And we'll cover that more with the dimension styles environment. But the fastest way is to highlight, right mouse click, and there's a precision option. And I can choose the number of decimal places for the dimension. So I highlight, select, right mouse click, and choose the precision. But what if I wanted 2 decimal places on all the dimensions and not just one? Well, that's where the dimension style comes into play. And so under Annotation, we can go to the Annotate ribbon, or we can choose the drop-down Annotation. If we choose the drop-down Annotation, there is a dimension text style and a dimension style. Well, the dimension style is what we're trying to set up here. And so under Standard, we're going to modify the standards from 4 decimal places to 2. So we pick Modify, and notice that under the primary units, it has precision. Key term, precision. Not round off, not scale factor, but precision. We want to set the precision to 2. Notice that it updates all the dimensions in the view window to 2 decimal places. That means any dimension that I place from now on is going to be a 2 decimal place dimension. And so I pick the endpoint of the arc, pick the top of the center line, and now we've got a dimension. And again, I'm picking the endpoint, creating a straight vertical or horizontal dimension, and there we have it. And so the key is, as we continue to dimension these, I can continue to pick dimension. Now, if I know that I'm doing a linear dimension, I can pick linear, and I'm going to pick the top and the bottom line. And we got a problem here because this 2.12 is now also getting cut by this 3.26. So how can we eliminate that? Well, I can edit dimensions also. So I can grab this data point and say I want to move the data point, the endpoint of that extension line, to this location. Hit the escape key, and now I'm measuring not from the center mark, but from the lower dimension. But that also now leaves me the opportunity to dimension from the center mark to the original object. And notice that it threw the dimension outside, and I don't necessarily think that's appropriate, so I'm going to go ahead and put this dimension on the inside here. And so now I've got that dimension placed within that drawing environment. So all I did there was grab the text grip point and move it inside. So those are linear dimensions. We also have under linear the ability to do aligned and angular. So angular dimensions are unique because when I pick a flat surface and I pick a angled surface, it gives me the ability to do an angled dimension, which works really, really simply and really, really well. I also have the ability under this to do align dimensioning. So an align dimension gives me a true length distance of an angled line. Now that might be really important, or it may not be really. It might be really important of a data point that you need to gather. Let's say, for example, if you're doing a plot plan and you've got an angled bearing line for an edge of a piece of property and you need to know what that distance is. Well, I can select the 2 angled points and then provide a dimension between those 2 points that lie on that angled surface. So on the actual true length of this line is 1.93 inches. But if I actually did a vertical dimension, the vertical dimension will not be 1.93, but 1.98. So, and that includes the radius at the bottom with that. But the point being is that, or I can even do it to the endpoint here, to here. It's 1.91. It's actually smaller. But the point being on this is that selecting the proper points or using the proper tool like an align to get an angular dimension that you can use, an angular distance that you can use, is important. We also have radius and diameter dimensions, and so we can choose radius, and I just hit the drop down here. And again, everything I'm talking about is also under the Annotate ribbon. Under the Annotate ribbon, you'll have dimensions, linear, and then all the options like we were looking at with the drop down. They also have break, where you can break dimension lines. So where we had the crossing over here, I could break those dimension lines if necessary. And again, if there's another way around it, it's best not to break the dimension line. But if there's no other way, you can go ahead and do that kind of a development. We also have a linear option. And with that linear option, we have the radius. And so we're going to pick the radius, and this is the radius of this arc here, and that's going to be 0.25. So I'm hesitant to put it right where the intersection is, just so it doesn't muddy exactly what we're looking at here. But we've got a 0.25 there. We have another, I just right mouse clicked on my mouse, and we can repeat the dimension radius. And so I can bring this up, and we've got a 0.06 radius. And so we have to kind of be careful with that process. And we have another radius that we're going to do here. And then I've got diameters also. And again, the diameter is the complete circle value. And so I'll put a diameter dimension here, or I can even move that out here. And I can also put a diameter dimension here. And again, diameter dimensions, again selecting those circles. Back to linear, we can then do overall dimensions from the endpoint to an endpoint. But if I know that the line goes the full length and I can dimension that line, then I can actually just pick linear, right mouse click, and it asks me to select an object. So I can pick just an object. I can't pick between two objects, but just a single object to get a dimension. And that may or may not be appropriate. Like in this case, it only does the line between the arcs. And so that may not be appropriate to get an overall height, but I can still edit this, move the grips to where they need to go to get the actual height. So I'm not recreating the dimension, I'm just using that dimension as a tool to generate specific information. Big thing to remember about dimensions is that every feature, every circle, every arc, every slot needs to have a size and a position. And if we don't have a size and a position, we can't replicate that particular object. And so whenever you're dimensioning, always think about, is there a size and a position dimension to that feature? Can I create that feature based on the size and the position of the dimensions that I'm providing? And so those are the key components as you go through in dimension drawings. As we continue to add dimensions to this drawing, we'll see that these angles are not the same. Okay, they're off by a degree. The height is different, obviously. Then we've got a width here that we haven't done yet. There's quite a few dimensions that haven't been put in just yet. But I wanted to mention one thing. I've got two of the same circles here, and I've dimensioned it already once. I don't have to dimension a second time, but what I can do is double click on that dimension. You can see that I've got a flashing cursor. Use your arrow key to move the cursor to the other side, put a space bar in, capital TYP, and then hit the then hit the escape key, not the enter key. If you hit the enter key, you'll go down to the next line and continue typing. But if you hit the escape key, it'll ask you, do you want to save your text changes? Yes. And now I'll have a 0.75 TYP, which indicates typical, which means that if I don't dimension this circle here, it's assumed that those circles are now the same size since only one is dimensioned with a typical dimensional value. And I can do the same thing here, 0.06 TYP, put a space in, hit the escape key. Yes, I'll save that. So then all these small dimensions, dimensional radii, are all going to be 0.6. And the 0.25 can be done the same way. But what happens if you run out of room? Well, then we just have to adjust the dimension, in this case the 141 dimension, and we need to move that out a little bit farther so it doesn't interfere with the other dimension. And so you can adjust them down and around by using those grip tools. So that gets you the option of the basic dimensioning processes. Again, every object must have a size and position feature value, which means that the center marks have to be dimensioned both horizontally and vertically. The circles need to be dimensioned, arcs need to be dimensioned, the lines need to be dimensioned. I don't know what the width is between these two entities, so I better put a dimension in between those two. But then where do I put it? But if I know the radius of 0.112 here, that radius is now doubled for that width. So I don't need that value. So you can think through this process and think through to ask that question, is the size and position dimensioned? That'll get you started on the dimensioning process. Have a great day. See you soon.